Hello everyone and welcome back to our reading of Sasquatch, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men, or at least my copy says Sasquatch. Today's chapter, Shooting a Sasquatch. Let's get started. The Patterson Film. The short cinefilm shot by Roger Patterson on October 20th, 1967 in the Bluff Creek area of Northern California remains the most important single piece of evidence for the existence of a real, upright, walking hominid ape that was living wild in North America. Some might argue that the cumulative evidence of footprints, sightings, and other evidence is even more persuasive, but the Patterson movie remains one of the most famous and controversial proofs of the existence of cryptids. Patterson and his companion that day, Bob Gimlin, have been hailed as heroes and condemned as crooks. They have been praised for their skill at tracking down a Sasquatch or dismissed as lucky amateurs, even by those who now believe the film is genuine. Those who are convinced that the film is a fake have either condemned Patterson and Gimlin as hoaxers and frauds, or written them off as the gullible instruments of a fraud perpetrated by others. Given the massive amounts of controversy that still surround the film, it is interesting to look not only at the film itself and what it seems to show, but also at the background to it. Details of events surrounding the film are often passed over, but they can shed much needed light on the events of that autumnal day. In 1967, Roger Patterson was a rodeo rider living at Yakima, Washington, but because work was intermittent, he did odd jobs for his brother-in-law, Al DeAtley. Patterson was also very interested in the Sasquatch enigma. He seems to have missed the excitement that centered around the events of 1958 at the Bluff Creek roadworks, but in 1964 he read an article by Ivan T. Sanderson. In that article, Sanderson compared the evidence for Sasquatch with that for the Yeti of the Himalayas. At this date, Sanderson was referring to all such supposed cryptids as ABSM, abominable snowmen, the translation of one of these Nepalese names for the Yeti. Patterson became very interested in the idea that there might be an American abominable snowman living near his own home. As a result, he spent some of his spare time collecting reports, interviewing witnesses, and casting footprints. On some of these trips, he was accompanied by a friend named Bob Gimlin. Gimlin was a part-time horse breeder, part-time rodeo rider, and occasional construction worker. He was also partly descended from the Yakima, and like all First Nations people, he had heard stories about the hairy man-apes all his life, but did not really take them very seriously. He did, however, enjoy the outdoors, and was happy to travel the wilderness areas with his friend Patterson when he had nothing better to do. In 1966, Patterson pulled all his material together in a book entitled Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist? It sold fairly well locally, but did not make much of a profit. Patterson then had the idea of making a documentary film about these mystery apes. Although he did not really know much about the television business, and did not even own a camera, he decided to get some footage of witness interviews and footprints using a camera hired from a camera shop in Yakima, and then try to get somebody from the TV business interested in the idea. Into the wilderness. In early October, Patterson got a call from one of his contacts in the growing community of Sasquatch investigators, a man from Willow Creek in California called Al Hodgson. Hodgson told him that some excellent new tracks had been found in the Blue Creek Mountain area. They were being studied by John Green and Rene de Hinden. It was thought that one set of very large footprints had been made by a big male, a smaller set of footprints by a female, and a third, much smaller set of prints by a juvenile. Patterson contacted Gimlin, who agreed to go along. This was important because Gimlin had a truck and a horse van that allowed the pair to take horses with them and then ride into the wilderness. Without Gimlin, Patterson would have been on foot and unable to cover so much ground. The pair arrived on October 6th, by which time heavy rains had washed away the tracks that Patterson had hoped to film. They decided to stay, though, having come prepared for a 2-week visit. The pair would drive to a likely area, make camp, and then take to their horses and spend the day riding about looking for footprints or other signs of Sasquatch. On October 20th, they were camped in a Bluff Creek area. They spent the morning riding separately, then around noon joined up to explore a particularly rugged and remote region centered around a canyon. Thinking that they might stay out overnight, the men loaded a pack horse. Patterson rode in front and Gimlin followed up behind, leading the animal. Both men were armed, but it was Patterson who had the cinecamera in his saddlebags. According to Patterson and Gimlin, they had been riding for some hours when they reached a pile of fallen trees and broken logs that had been left there by a flood back in 1964. The obstruction blocked their view up the canyon, but also masked them from the sight of anything beyond it. As they came around the log jam, they saw a Sasquatch beside the creek about 80 feet from them. The creature saw them at the same time, and it stood up abruptly and stared at them. At this point, Patterson's horse began bucking and trying to turn around. Patterson grabbed the cinecamera from the saddlebag, then sprang down from the horse, which bolted off downstream. Gimlin's horse was older and more placid, but even so it began to get agitated. When the Sasquatch began to walk off along the creek bank, heading for the dense forests that lined the canyon, Patterson got the cinecamera working and yelled out, "Cover me!" to Gimlin. At this, Gimlin pulled out his rifle, thereby letting go of the pack horse, which headed off downstream after Patterson's mount. Close encounter. Patterson was now running forward with the camera to his eye, trying to keep the Sasquatch in shot. He did not see a sudden rise in the ground, so he tripped and fell. The Sasquatch turned to stare at him. Fearing the creature might attack, Gimlin rode over to the creek, dismounted, and aimed his rifle at the Sasquatch, now only about 60 feet away. Scrambling back to his feet, Patterson refocused the camera on the Sasquatch, which was by now walking off again. The creature turned again to look at the two men, but did not break its stride as it had done before. It continued to walk away, and then passed around a bend in the canyon. That was when Patterson ran out of film, but the two men could still hear the creature moving off. It seemed to be running quite fast. Gimlin and Patterson hurriedly discussed the situation. Gimlin thought the creature had been approaching 7 feet tall and weighed around 300 pounds. Patterson thought it had been a foot taller and much heavier. Both men had noticed that the creature had breasts, and concluded that it was a female. Gimlin wanted to push up on the creek in pursuit of the creature, but Patterson refused. His rifle was still on his horse, and he did not know where that had got to. Patterson pointed out that they had come out looking for a family group of Sasquatch, but had seen only one female. The much larger male might be nearby, and it would probably not be as timid as the female had been when it saw the humans, especially if it thought that they might be threatening its mate and its young. The two men headed back downstream, caught the two horses which had stopped only a short distance away, and returned to the site of the encounter. After tying the pack horse up, they headed off upstream, taking care not to disturb the Sasquatch tracks. They then followed the tracks for about 600 yards. The trail turned away from the creek and into the wooded slopes of the canyon, at which point they probed just far enough to confirm that the creature had headed uphill, then stopped. Again Gimlin wanted to push on, but Patterson did not. He was still nervous about the big male and the ability of the rifles to stop such a big beast. Moreover, he wanted to get back to the footprints. By this time it was late afternoon and dusk would soon close in. The weather did not look too promising, and Patterson was keen to carry on filming and cast the tracks before night closed in. With the new film in the camera, he took extensive shots of the Sasquatch tracks and then cast the clearest footprints that he could find. Other good prints were covered over with bark and twigs to protect them from the threatening rain. Patterson and Gimlin rode back to their camp, cared for the horses, and then climbed into the truck. They drove to Eureka to post the precious movie film off for processing. Patterson was worried that he might not have got much usable film because he had been running for part of the time and then had fallen to his knees. On the way back to camp, they stopped off to see Al Hodgson, and they told him about the day's events. Hodgson later recalled that although Patterson was hardly excited, he was fretting about how good the film would prove to be. The three men agreed that Hodgson should phone Green and Dahinden to tell them about the events while Patterson and Gimlin went back to camp. Word spread quickly among Sasquatch researchers. One of those to hear about Patterson's movie before it had been developed was Bob Titmus. He decided to travel into the scene of the encounter to study the tracks. By this time, Titmus had become a firm believer in the reality of Sasquatch. Although he had been a skeptic when he was initially involved in 1958, he now claimed to have seen one of the creatures for himself. He arrived at the narrow canyon site 8 days after the encounter. There had been a shower of rain in the meantime, but although this had erased some detail from the footprints, the main features were still clear. Titmus took some casts of the prints that Gimlin had covered over with bark and twigs to protect them from the rain. They showed the Sasquatch moving exactly as Patterson and Gimlin had claimed. Starting from the creek, the creature had gone upstream and then around the canyon corner before disappearing into the trees. He also measured the stride length and other details, confirming that the stride length increased markedly once the Sasquatch had been out of sight of the men. He measured the depth of the Sasquatch tracks at one point at 1.25 inches. He then measured his brother-in-law's footprints at the same point, and they were 0.25 inches deep. His brother-in-law weighed 200 pounds, so Titmus concluded that the Sasquatch must have weighed around 600 pounds. He then looked at the tracks of the horses and men. These were more confused. Because the men and the horses had moved back and forth, he was able to pick out Patterson's route while he had been filming, including his knee marks where he had fallen. Titmus then followed the Sasquatch tracks into the forest, well beyond the point where Patterson and Gimlin had given up the chase. The Sasquatch had actually turned round to go back down the canyon. After a few hundred feet, It had stopped and then sat down. Looking back downhill, Titmus realized that he had an uninterrupted view of the scene of the encounter. The Sasquatch must have sat here watching Patterson and Gimlin as they caught their horses, cast their footprints, and shot their film of the scene. It had then got up and walked off uphill and deeper into the forest. Titmus then returned to the scene of the encounter and backtracked the Sasquatch. When Patterson and Gimlin had first seen it, the Sasquatch had just crossed the creek and paused, perhaps to drink. On the other side of the creek, the tracks showed that the Sasquatch had come down from the forested mountain. Titmus followed them for over a quarter of a mile before he lost them. Some months later, the site was visited by John Green. He brought with him a student by the name of Jim McLaren, who at 6 feet 5 inches was the tallest man he could talk into accompanying him. Green stood where Patterson had been standing after his fall and filmed McLaren following the route of the Sasquatch. The movie would in due course reveal much, including the Sasquatch's height of around 7 feet 4 inches, but the most immediate revelation was that the creature had stepped up a 30-inch high bank without breaking its stride. Before moving on to look at the film in detail, it is worth pointing out a few features of the events as they had unfolded. First, Patterson was not a rich man, nor was he one of the mainstream researchers working on the Sasquatch enigma. His resources were very limited, and he was not able to access all of the information that was currently available. If, as many people have alleged, he faked the whole event, then he must have done so on a shoestring budget, and without being certain that his hoax figure would match what other researchers knew of the elusive creature. Second, Patterson had been excitedly telling Hodgson about the encounter before the film had been developed. Most of those who had been guilty of faking photos of UFOs and other enigmas have waited until they had produced a good fake before telling anyone about their alleged encounter with the unknown. Third, the Titmus visit showed that whatever made the Sasquatch tracks had walked for over 600 yards through the forest and then downhill to the creek, crossed the creek, and walked along the canyon before turning back into the forest and moving uphill for at least another 300 yards. This sort of behavior seems to have been very similar to that of a real wild creature. If the film had been a fake, it is much more likely that the tracks would have started and finished on the canyon floor where the filming took place. Of course, a fraudster might well think that laying extra prints would add credibility to the fake film, and so take the trouble to make the false trail. But neither Patterson nor Gimlin tried to persuade anyone to go look for these tracks, as they presumably would have done if they had spent time making them. It was only because Titmus went to the site of his own initiative that he found the tracks. Fourth, so far as is known, only Patterson and Gimlin knew where they were riding that day. If a third party had been playing a trick on them, that person would have needed to know where to go to act the part of a Sasquatch. Guarded reaction. Moreover, Gimlin was a crack shot, and unlike Patterson, was not known to anyone in the circle of Sasquatch researchers. He might have taken it into his head to open fire, and at such a short range would have almost certainly hit his target. Anyone prancing about in a monkey suit would have been running the very real risk of meeting an early death. Green and Dahinden were on hand when the film came back from the developers. When it was viewed, the film showed exactly what Patterson and Gimlin had said it would. The film was quickly copied, and the original stored in a bank vault for safekeeping. Green arranged for the movie to be shown to a panel of invited scientists at the University of British Columbia because none of the local institutions in the United States were willing to become linked to Sasquatch research. The reaction of the dozen or so scientists who did turn up was extremely guarded. Dr. Ian McTaggart Cohen, the Dean of the University of British Columbia and a zoologist, was enigmatic. The more a thing deviates from the known, the better the proof of its existence must be. Don Abbott, an anthropologist at the Provincial Museum of British Columbia, was equally cautious. It is about as hard to believe the film is faked as it is to admit that such a creature really lives. If there is a chance to follow up scientifically, my curiosity is such that I'd want to go along with it. Like most scientists, however, I'm not ready to put my reputation on the line until something concrete shows up, something like bones or a skull. Frank Beebe, a well-known Vancouver naturalist, made the following statement. I'm not convinced, but I think the film is genuine. From a scientific standpoint, one of the hardest facts to go against is that there is no evidence anywhere in the continent of ape evolution. Life magazine was contacted, and on the strength of the scientists in British Columbia not dismissing the film outright, arranged for it to be shown in New York at the American Museum of Natural History. Unlike British Columbia, Patterson and Green were not allowed in the room while the expert scientists watched the film and studied individual frames, nor were they allowed to take part in the press conference that followed. The New York scientists announced that in their view the film was a fake and the whole Sasquatch business was a colossal hoax. They prudently stopped short of actually accusing Patterson of faking the film himself, though that was the clear impression given to the journalists. The reasoning behind the verdict had nothing to do with the film itself, but rested on the grounds that it was impossible for there to be an unknown hominid ape in North America, and since that was impossible, it followed that the film had to be a fake. That damning verdict effectively killed the story for the mainstream media. Life magazine dropped the story. Argosy and Reader's Digest both ran short articles on the film, but then they too lost interest. At this point, Gimlin dropped out of the affair. He had never really been that interested in the Sasquatch, and he had a living to earn. Apart from one interview with a Vancouver radio station in November 1967, he has not since been involved. Whenever he has spoken on the subject, however, he has always insisted that the film is genuine, that he and Patterson really did encounter and film a Sasquatch, and that the Sasquatch is real. Until the day of his death, Patterson also firmly defended the validity of the film. Although the scientific establishment and the mainstream media had lost interest in the Patterson film, the growing circle of Sasquatch investigators had not. The general consensus among those who viewed the film was that it showed a creature that conformed to the descriptions given by witnesses who had encountered a Sasquatch. The question then resolved itself into whether the subject of the movie was a real Sasquatch or a fake that had been concocted to match the descriptions given by earlier eyewitnesses. Among the first experts to be consulted were the Disney movie studios, world leaders in animatronics and all aspects of animation in the late 1960s. They studied the film and confidently ruled out any form of animation or special effects, effectively ruling out any visual trickery. The film showed a real figure moving in real time in a real place. Given the limitations of special effects in 1967, this verdict has never been questioned. That left only two alternatives. Either the figure was a Sasquatch, or it was a man in a suit. The figure had, by this time, acquired the nickname of Patty among researchers. Walk like a man. One of the main early objections raised to the gait of Patty is that it resembles that of a man, not that of a woman, but the creature is very clearly a female with large breasts. It is true that Patty walks with a very masculine stride, but that does not necessarily mean that the creature is not female. The only known upright walking ape is the human. Walking styles are different in male and female humans because female hips are wider than those of a male. The reason for this is that the large brain of a human baby needs a large skull to accommodate it. Were it not for this large head, the hips of the female would not need to be wider than those of the male, and so the two sexes would have a similar gait. The Sasquatch does not seem to be any more intelligent than a gorilla or a chimpanzee, and witnesses do not describe a large-brained creature. This indicates that the skull of the baby Sasquatch is more in proportion to that of a baby gorilla than a baby human, so the female Sasquatch would not need to have wide hips. The apparently masculine walk of Patty would therefore be entirely consistent with the likely hip structure of a female Sasquatch. De Hinden then contacted a British professor of biomechanics called Don Grieve. His task was to compare the limb proportions and movements of the figure in the film to those of a human. If the figure was a human in a hairy outfit, this would show it up. Grieve began with the limb proportions and quickly concluded that Patty had leg-to-body proportions similar to those of a man. The arms, however, were different. They were longer than those of a human, and the elbow was lower down. The proportions of the arm have come in for much study because they seem to point to a clear difference between the Sasquatch and a human. The ratio between a human leg and arm is about 10:7. That of the creature in the Patterson film is more like 10:9. Grieve then turned to the speed of the walk, the length of the stride, and the angles formed by the thighs and the knees as the creature moved. It was clear from these that the way in which Patty walked was very different from a normal human walk. In particular, the creature did not at any time lock its knees into a straight line, something which all humans do. This did not mean that the figure was not a man walking in a deliberately unusual manner. Grieve then did more calculations and came back with a query. At what speed in frames per second had the film been shot? The question was crucial. If the film had been shot at 24 FPS or more, then a human male could have managed to mimic the walking style with a bit of effort. But if the film had been shot at a slower speed, no human could have moved his legs in the manner shown. Patterson had already been asked this question by researchers trying to determine Patty's speed. He had replied that he usually set the Cine camera at 24 FPS, but when he had reloaded the film to shoot the tracks after the sighting, he had noticed that the camera was set to 16 FPS. Perhaps it had been jolted out of its usual setting when he had stumbled, or when the camera had been bounced about in the saddlebags of his horse, when it had become frightened, but he could not be certain. There was an added complication in that the model of camera that Patterson had used was not entirely reliable. Kodak, who made it, allowed for a 10% margin of error on FPS speed, so if set at 24 FPS, the camera might actually be running at anything between 21.6 and 26.4 FPS. It was a Soviet researcher named Igor Burtsev who found the answer. He noted that the start of the movie showed a series of up and down shudders. It was at this point that Patterson claimed that he had been running toward the Sasquatch, so Burtsev thought that the shudders might have been caused by Patterson's feet hitting the ground. At 24 FPS, the shudders indicated that Patterson had been taking 6 steps per second, but at 16 FPS they indicated that he was taking 4 steps per second. When running, it is simply impossible for a human to take more than 5 steps per second. This indicated very strongly that the actual FPS speed of the film in the camera had been between 14 and 18, according to Grieve, that rolled out a man in a fursuit. Another objection that was raised to the creature in the Patterson film and to Sasquatch in general was that the alleged animal showed an odd mixture of ape-like and human-like features. Given the state of knowledge about hominid evolution in the later 1960s, this was a valid criticism. If a Sasquatch does exist, it should be a side branch of either human or great ape evolution. In the 1960s, it seemed inconceivable that a great ape could walk upright, or that a primitive human would have an ape's head. Since then, a great deal more has been learned about the evolution of both apes and humans, although there is still no obvious ancestral line that could lead to a creature such as the Sasquatch. We are now aware that the evolutionary trees of the two lines were a lot more complex than previously thought. The odd mixture of ape and human features no longer appears as unlikely as it once did. Less than 18 months after the Patterson film was shot, rumors began to filter out of the Hollywood movie industry. It was being said that Patty was a man wearing a suit produced by a special effects and makeup artist of great fame. The contemporary reports did not name the man involved, but it was an open secret in Hollywood that he was John Chambers. Chambers worked on a vast number of projects from the 1950s to the 1970s, both in television and the movies. The project of most relevance to the Patterson film was the movie Planet of the Apes, released in 1968. Chambers had been responsible for the makeup and the outfits worn by the upright walking apes. The story linking Chambers to the Patterson movie circulated widely in Hollywood. It was one of those odd secrets that everyone in a fairly closed industry knows about, and delights in revealing to outsiders to demonstrate their inside knowledge. As such, it cropped up in newspapers from time to time. Chambers did not confirm or deny the reports. He just smiled knowingly. In fact, the tale did the career of John Chambers no end of good. In 1971, he even worked on a film about a homicidal Bigfoot terrorizing a group of attractive students. The Bigfoot in this movie, Schlock, is oddly not as realistic as the one in the Patterson film. The story was finally laid to rest by Chambers himself in 1997, after his retirement from the movie business. He gave an interview in which he denied knowing anything about Patterson, Gimlin, or their film until long after it was taken. "I was good," Chambers said of his makeup talents in relation to the Patterson film, "but I was never that good." Meanwhile, Dr. Grover Krantz and others had been studying the Patterson film, with the aim of deducing the size of measurements of the creature that it showed. There were two basic starting points for the work. The first was the film shot by John Green of John McLaren following the route of the Sasquatch. Comparisons were made between McLaren's known height and the various objects in Green's film, such as tree stumps and fallen logs, and these were cross-referenced back to the original film. The other was a couple of frames in the footage where the soles of one of the Sasquatch's feet are shown clearly. The footprints cast by Patterson and Titmus gave the size of the feet, which allowed the size of the creature to be scaled up from the image of the sole of the foot. Although there are some slight differences of opinion among the various researchers, the overall picture that has emerged from these computations is clear. The creature is, give or take, an inch, 7 feet 4 inches tall. This is not far off what Patterson thought at the time. The chest circumference of the creature is around 50 inches, and the circumference of the hips is about the same. In fact, the entire body of the creature is remarkably straight, showing none of the curves in and out that are more typical of human bodies. This would indicate that the creature was much more massive than a human of the same height would be. A weight of around 700 pounds would not be impossible. The head of Patty in the film is consistent with other eyewitness reports. The jaw is heavy, and it projects further forward than that of a human, but not so much as that of a gorilla. The creature's face is fairly deep and is dominated by a flattened nose and heavy ridges over the eyes, while the top of the head slopes back sharply from the eye ridges to reach a peaked crest near the back. There are no visible ears. Overall, it is partway between the head of a human and that of a large ape. The peak on the back of the head could be explained in two different ways. On the one hand, it may be formed of stiff, upright hairs that form a mane. Some eyewitnesses have said that the hair on the head of the Sasquatch they encountered was longer than elsewhere. Indeed, in a few frames of the Patterson film, the peak does seem to bounce as if it were made of hair, but this movement is not very clear. On the other hand, it might be made of muscles, attached to a crest of bone sticking up from the center of the skull. Gorillas have this feature, known as a sagittal crest, in exaggerated form. The purpose of a sagittal crest is to provide attachment for jaw muscles too powerful to be accommodated on a smooth skull top, such as that possessed by humans. This head is mounted on a short neck that is so thick and muscled that the head seems to merge directly into the shoulders. Other eyewitnesses have commented that the creature that they saw did not seem to have a neck, and this is probably what they meant. The arrangement of muscles that would give this impression would be associated with a heavy skull equipped with heavy jaws. Taken altogether, these features of Patty would indicate that it has large teeth set in massive jaws that are worked by very powerful jaw muscles. The brain case would be much smaller than that of a human, but it may be relatively larger than that of a gorilla. The fact that the face is flatter than that of the otherwise broadly similar gorilla or chimpanzee could be explained as an adaptation to the creature's upright stance. Muscle movement. Another feature of the creature in the film that has come in for much study is the apparent movement of the muscles under the skin. At several points in the film, the skin bulges or slackens in apparent response to the muscles. The movement of these muscles is entirely consistent with what would happen when real muscles flex and relax at the different stages of a stride. In other words, they are anatomically correct. Some researchers have concluded that these muscle movements show that there is muscle tissue working directly underneath the skin. Because no human has the massively wide body, nor the thick limbs of Patty, they maintain that the creature is a genuine animal that exists exactly as it appears. This does not quite follow. Even in 1967, it was possible to fake muscle movement beneath false skin by the use of carefully shaped and cunningly positioned balloons inflated by compressed air. However, such devices were only used on fake limbs that were not attached to a real body. Quite how a person inside a monkey suit could have operated such devices while walking along has never been satisfactorily explained, but that does not mean that it was not done. Taken as a whole, the various studies of the Patterson film and its contents produce an intriguing series of conclusions. First, the object being filmed is quite clearly really there. It is not a special effect that was added on later. Second, the appearance of the creature is entirely consistent with everything that eyewitnesses have reported about the Sasquatch either before or since. Third, it is very unlikely, but not entirely impossible, for the moving figure to be a human male in a cleverly wrought suit. Even today, the manufacture of a suit that was able to move and act like the creature in Patterson's film would be a very long and costly operation. Back in 1967, it is doubtful if such a suit could have been made. Even if it were possible, it would have cost a vast amount of money and would have required a remarkable scale of technical skill and ability. Given that Roger Patterson was an out-of-work rodeo rider, it is obviously impossible for him to have either made such a suit himself or paid somebody else to do it. There remains the possibility that somebody else was involved, either in collaboration with Patterson or playing a hoax on him. Nobody has ever come forward to take the credit for that role. The most widely discussed candidate, John Chambers, ruled himself out. In 1999, a lawyer based in Washington State announced that he had a client who claimed to have donned a monkey suit and walked up the creek for Patterson to film. The client apparently passed a lie detector test, but he backed out of a news conference at the last minute after issuing a statement through the same lawyer that he was trying to negotiate a fee with a national newspaper for an exclusive interview. The mystery man has not been heard from again. But despite its great fame and the huge amount of attention that has been lavished upon it, the Patterson film is not the only moving film that appears to show a Sasquatch. In 1995, a second film emerged that was to become known as the Redwoods footage. It has an apparent Sasquatch in view for only 25 seconds, and it is not very clear, having been shot at night by the light of a vehicle's headlights in conditions of light rain. The Redwoods footage. The film was taken by a professional videographer named Craig Miller on Rocker Road in Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park in Northern California, a site that is only 30 miles from the location of the Patterson encounter. Miller had spent August 28, 1995, out in the woods filming a television show about the lifestyle of a Playboy model named Anna Marie Goddard, who had gained fame as the magazine's 40th anniversary Playmate of the Month. The film crew and team were being driven back to their hotel by Colin Goddard, Anna Marie's husband. As they came round a corner, Goddard spotted a hairy human-like figure crossing the road in front of the vehicle. It was perhaps 8 feet tall. He called out to the team behind him, and Miller happened to have his video camera in his hand. Hurriedly scrambling forward, he caught a short section of video. It showed the creature move off the highway and then turn to face the approaching small coach before it darted off into the undergrowth. When it first emerged, the film was dubbed the Playmate footage, but the name was quickly dropped when it became clear that this frivolous tag would make it even less likely to be taken seriously by scientists. In the event, the very fact that Miss Goddard had been present ensured that many researchers thought that the footage might be no more than a publicity stunt for the model. She has consistently denied this, as have the other people present at the encounter. The creature in the video is about 30 yards away when the film begins. Goddard brakes to a halt as the creature walks in front of the vehicle at a distance of about 5 yards, passing through the headlight beams as it does so. He chooses that moment to switch the lights to full beam, thereby illuminating the figure clearly. The creature raises an arm to shield its eyes, then walks off to the side of the road before turning to stare at the camera. It then strides off into the trees and is lost from view. Given the poor visibility of the rainy night, it is hardly surprising that the video is of rather poor quality. However, because it was on videotape, the footage was easy to digitize and then enhance through a variety of formats. This work was undertaken under the direction of Dr. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy with an interest in the Sasquatch. It revealed a number of interesting features that were not readily apparent in the original video. The size of the creature could now be deduced by comparing the footage with the measurements of trees and other objects at the site of the encounter. This suggested that its height was within the range of 6 feet 4 inches to 7 feet 2 inches. The enhancement also showed that the creature was very similar to the Sasquatch in the Patterson film, except that it lacked breasts and seemed to be much shaggier, with especially long hair around the head and neck. As the legs moved, there appeared to be a patch of muscle moving beneath the skin on the buttock, which corresponds to the main muscle that pulls the leg back. An object can also be seen sticking out from the front of the body, just below the waist. The curved object is not very clear, but Meldrum theorized that it might be the animal's penis. Some male apes are known to display their penis as a signal of dominance or confidence when confronted by a threat or a rival. Impressive though the redwoods footage is in many ways, the poor quality of the video means that some have dismissed it as a hoax. There is simply not enough detail available to be able to rule out the possibility of the creature being a human in a disguise. Some researchers also feel that some of the people involved might have had access to special effects skills in view of their connection to the TV industry. The Memorial Day footage. The following year, another video of what might have been a Sasquatch was taken. Because it was shot on May 26th, it has become known as the Memorial Day footage. Owen Pate, his wife and 5 friends were on a camping trip in the Pasayten Wilderness area, Washington State. From their campsite, Pate and his wife saw a strange figure standing next to a bush on the edge of some woodland about 75 yards away. The figure turned to look at them, then moved off back into the cover of the woods. Mrs. Pate went to get their video camera, while Pate and the others discussed what they had seen. Some thought it had been a Bigfoot. Others were not sure. A few minutes later, the figure reappeared about 100 yards from its first position. It then ran across the open hillside, behind a small hillock, and into another stretch of woodland. A total of 22 seconds of the video shot by Mrs. Pate contains images of the figure. The video was reported to researchers and underwent the usual enhancement procedures. The figure was so far away that it is impossible to see any real detail other than its silhouette. Disappointing though this was, it did reveal an interesting feature. When first seen, the creature was swinging only one arm as it ran. The other seemed to be holding something. After passing the hillock, it seemed to be taller than before. Further digital enhancement seemed to show that the figure had in fact put something on its shoulder. It has been suggested, though the video is so indistinct that it is impossible to be certain, that the video shows a mother Sasquatch and its baby. At first the baby is held in one arm, pressed against the mother's body. The baby is then hoisted up onto the adult's shoulders. Further investigations at the site seem to show that the initial figure was under 6 feet tall at first, its height then increasing by about 6 inches. It was seen to be running as it moved. When a man set off to follow the identical route, he found that he could easily cover the ground in the same time as the figure. There has never been any suggestion that the Pates or their friends faked the film, but at the same time the resolution is so poor that it is impossible to be certain what it shows. The Freeman footage. Much clearer, though still not as well defined as the Patterson film, was a movie shot by forestry worker Paul Freeman in 1994. According to his own account, Freeman had seen an 8-foot-tall Bigfoot on June 10, 1982, when working in forests near Walla Walla, Washington State. When he told his workmates about the encounter, he had come in for a lot of teasing, and at times, boisterous horseplay. As a result, he began carrying a movie camera to work. In later years, he updated to a video camera. Thus, it was that he was carrying a video camera when he spotted a line of Bigfoot tracks in woodland in the Blue Mountains area. Freeman measured a few footprints to gauge their size and stride length, then got out his camera and began filming the track as he followed it. He then heard movement in the undergrowth ahead of him and lifted up the camera just in time to catch a short glimpse of a tall, hairy, human-like figure walking across the path that he had been following. The figure turned to glance at him, then slipped into the brush and out of sight. Freeman advanced along the path with his camera still running. The apparent Bigfoot was then seen again some distance off, and Freeman moved the camera to remain focused on it. As the Bigfoot was walking away, it bent down to pick something up before striding off to be lost from view in the woodland. As with other video footage, the Freeman footage, as the film has become known, was of relatively poor quality, but could be subjected to digital enhancements. The figure in the video seems to be a fairly typical Sasquatch creature that is moving with a purposeful stride. The object that it bends down to pick up is poorly defined, but some viewers think that it might be a juvenile Sasquatch. Generally, however, the distance of the subject from the camera and a lack of definition makes this a difficult video to extract much information from. Dr. Esteban Sarmiento, a functional anatomist at the American Museum of Natural History, studied the video but was unable to form any firm conclusions about it. F for fake. Freeman proved to be almost as controversial a figure in Sasquatch research circles as Ray Wallace had been a generation earlier. On the credit side, he produced a large number of footprint casts as well as the Freeman footage video, and collected a large number of eyewitness accounts. There can be no doubting the amount of time he spent out in the forests looking for Sasquatch evidence, nor the contribution that he made to Sasquatch studies. However, the very fact that Freeman found so many tracks and other evidence, while others were much less successful, made some researchers suspicious. When a few of the tracks that he had discovered were found to have features that indicated that they might have been fakes, suspicions deepened. Rene Dahinden and Bob Titmus thought Freeman was simply a hoaxer seeking attention, but others were unconvinced. To the day of his death in 2003, Freeman maintained that the video footage he shot was genuine, though even he accepted that some of the footprints he had discovered may have been faked by some unidentified third party. The Manitoba footage. On April 16, 2005, a new film of what appeared to be a Sasquatch was taken, and it soon became known as the Manitoba footage. It was shot at the Norway House Ferry on the banks of the Nelson River by Bobby Clark, who operated the ferry. The location was astonishingly remote, It was almost 50 miles from the nearest settlement and was set amid a mature coniferous forest. According to Clark, he first noticed a strange figure on the far bank of the river. At first, he thought it might be a fur trapper, but on looking more closely, he realized that the figure was covered in fur. Having a video camera to hand, he filmed it. He later showed the video to his family, who took a copy and showed it to friends. Word slowly leaked out, and the video was eventually aired on ACA television. Despite the hype that it revealed, the Manitoba footage did not show much detail of the figure. Like so many other short excerpts of video or film that have appeared over the years, the Manitoba footage proved to be interesting and mysterious. The other videos include the Marble Mountains footage, the Lembo Lake film, Bob Dagon surveillance clips, and Keating's White Creature. All of them, however, are of low technical quality and show little more than a blurred or indistinct figure that looks a bit like a Sasquatch. None of them comes even close to the Patterson film in terms of quality, lighting, or subject clarity. If the Patterson film has failed to convince skeptics or scientists, then subsequent movies and videos have even less chance of convincing the scientific world of the reality of the Sasquatch. Researchers have therefore sought to rely on the physical evidence that does exist. There is certainly plenty of that to be found. Yes, indeed. Well, I hope you won't forgive me if I, don't give my opinion with the constant going back and forth of the Patterson-Gimlin footage. I've stopped caring on if it's real or not. Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you next time. See ya!